Thank you for attending this session, which is the first of 4 in this series on the codes that apply to electrified hardware. I'm Lori Green. I'm the Manager, Codes and Resources for Allegion, and today's topic is access control hardware and the UL 294 and UL 1034 listings that apply to some electrified hardware applications. I'm really excited about this topic because out of all the code questions I receive, this is probably the most common area of the model codes that I'm asked about, and there have been a lot of misinterpretations happening. So we're going to try to cut through some of those today. There have been some code changes that I think are going to help with the understanding of the intent of the code, so we'll cover all of those. So as I said, I'm Lori. You may have visited my website. I hope you have. idighardware.com. That's where I write about door openings and the codes that apply every weekday, pretty much. And I'm going to start with a presentation that covers some of the code requirements, and then I will be answering questions along with my colleagues, Mark Kuhn, who's one of our Allegion specification consultants, and Matt Phillips, who is our compliance engineering manager. We all have kind of different specialties, so hopefully we'll be able to cover all of the questions. So we did receive some questions with the registrations for this session and by email, so I will cover those first. I wanted to have some slides and some images and code excerpts and things to point to. So the most common question is which electrified hardware applications require the listings? And the second most common question is which components of a system require the listings according to the model codes. There were also a bunch of questions about special locking arrangements and normal locking arrangements. So we'll go through all of that and hopefully come out the other end with a better understanding. So before we get started on the main topic, I just want to mention a few general things. First, this session, like all of my code classes and sessions, they all cover the model code requirements. Usually I talk about the most recent editions of the code. Sometimes I go a little bit forward, a little bit backward. And so currently we're on the 2024 editions of the model codes. That's what's available. That might not be what is being used in your area. The 2027 editions will be out shortly. And then the codes for the individual states, cities, other countries may vary, so it's important to refer to the adopted codes to find specific information. For example, if you work in a healthcare facility, you might be saying, well, we still use the 2012 edition of NFPA 101, which is the case for most healthcare facilities. And in that edition, only 2 sections of the special locking arrangements require the UL 294 listing for hardware. So if you have questions about the local codes, we have a team of ACEs, the Allegion code experts. They can help answer them, and to find them, you just go to idighardware.com. There's an orange ball on the right-hand side, and you click on that, and it will connect you, give you your local person in your state who should be able to answer your questions with the local code requirements. The next thing I want to mention is that Matt, Mark, and I all work with the Builders Hardware Manufacturers Association, or BHMA, in code development. And in each code change cycle, we usually have at least a couple dozen code change proposals related to doors. So we really have done a lot of work in clarifying the codes and getting kind of ahead of it rather than waiting to see what the new code requires. We are there helping to make those changes. So we don't make all the changes. Some of the changes that I will talk about today were made by other groups, but we do work in that organization. And the important thing to remember with regard to that is some of the changes are actual changes, and they can't be implemented until a particular code has been adopted in your area, in your jurisdiction. But other changes are clarifications, and for me, those can be used right away for a better understanding of the intent of the code. So we have some of each of those in today's presentation and probably in the Q&A as well. So the biggest misconceptions about UL 294, and it seems like how can a listing be such a cause of pain for me anyway. Partly it's because there were a lot of misconceptions around when and where this listing is required. So it's not required for every single piece of electrified hardware. And not every piece of electrified hardware has the listing, and it's not appropriate for every piece to have the listing. So there are sections in the model codes where the listing is specifically referenced. Those are commonly known as the special locking arrangements. But the most common electrified hardware application is not a special locking arrangement, and the model codes don't require the listings for those systems. So I'm going to talk about this more later and the code changes that were made to help clarify this. So here's an example from the 2021 IBC. I told you I might go back and forward in time. So this is from the International Building Code. This is the 2021 edition. And this section addresses the door hardware release of electrically locked egress doors. So what's that? That's first problem. What kind of hardware are we talking about here? So this type of system typically involves an electromagnetic lock that's released by a switch in the panic hardware, the lock set, or the sensor bar that's mounted on the door. And you'll see here item 6 requires the locking system units to be listed to UL 294. So next question, what is a locking system unit? Is it the lock? Is it the power supply, the reader, the hinge, the electric hinge, the power transfer? I don't know. So I didn't put it in there. So the commentary for the International Building Code uses that same term. So it was really unclear which components of the system require the listing. I've had requests for every different type of situation you can imagine. In the 2024 edition of the International Building Code and the International Fire Code, or the I codes, this language has been updated in all of the sections that previously referenced UL 294. So these sections now specifically mention the locking device. It says the electromechanical or electromagnetic locking device. And then it clarifies that the listings don't apply to every component because it's specifically saying the locks. So that's really helpful in clarifying what the intent of the codes was. There are some systems where the lock, let's say a delayed egress lock, for example, might require a UL 294 listed power supply, but that's part of the hardware listings. It's not a model code listing, but just something to be aware of. The other change that was made in this section was to permit UL 1034 as an alternative to UL 294. So I would consider the first part of this a clarification that helps us to understand more about the intent of what the codes are looking for, whether it's which component, in this case it's the lock. And then I would consider the addition of UL 1034 as an alternative as a change that is not implemented until the 2024 code is adopted in a project's jurisdiction. So just keep that in mind. We've got one clarification, one change. A similar change has been made to NFPA 101, which is the life safety code. Again, this is the section for door hardware release of electrically locked egress door assemblies. Nobody ever said it was easy, but in this section, it's the same, usually a mag lock released by a switch in the door mounted hardware. That's the key. So like the I codes, this section references the electromechanical or electromagnetic locking hardware, but it specifies that this applies to new installations, which is a little bit different from the IBC and the IFC. The 2024 edition of NFPA 101 also permits either UL 294 or UL 1034. And what it previously said was hardware for new installations is listed in accordance with UL 294 access control system units. So we kind of had the same problem, like just says hardware, which hardware? So now this change is helping us understand more about the intent. And then as always in the NFPA codes, if there's an asterisk, that tells us that there's more information in the Annex A. And when I use red italicized text on the slide, that means it's coming straight from the code. So here you can see exactly what the code says. So Matt can get into this in more detail if there are questions, because he spends much more time with these standards than I do. But my understanding is that UL 294 looks at the reliability of the entire system, including software and power consumption, while UL 1034 addresses the physical strength of the lock itself. So for some products, it makes more sense to use one standard or the other, which is why the model codes now allow either or. So going back to our 2021 IBC example, we see the locking system units language and the reference to UL 294. And then looking at the same section in the 2024 edition of the IBC, we see the clarification showing that the listing applies to the locks and the change is there that permits UL 1034 in addition or as an alternative to UL 294. There might be other listings that are required. If the door is a swinging fire door assembly, then the components of the assembly are going to be listed to UL 10C as well. If the door is serving an area that requires panic hardware, the hardware is going to have to be listed to UL 305. So there might be some other listings as well. The IBC commentary for this section includes some further information that states that the requirement for the listing does not apply to locks that are part of an access control system, also known as an ingress control system. So that's interesting. What does that mean? So that brings us to our next clarification, which includes both the special locking arrangements and these access control systems that are mentioned here in the commentary, or I like to call them normal locking arrangements. So not everybody has run into that term before, but it works well in conjunction with we have special locking arrangements and we have our normal locking arrangements. So typically the listing requirements apply to special locking arrangements, and those are all listed here. And for many editions of the codes, these systems have had specific code sections that address them. So if you want to look at delayed egress, you can go and find the section on that. Or if you want to look at stairwell reentry, you can go find the section on that. But this list does not include all types of electrified hardware systems, including the most common type of access control system that I mentioned on the previous slide. So I'm going to cover some of these special locking arrangements in future sessions, but just to get us started, I put a few in here to compare. So here we have two that are kind of similar because these two systems are both usually used with electromagnetic locks. So the sensor release section, that's the door on the left, addresses doors where the lock is released by a sensor detecting a building occupant approaching the door. So I'm approaching the door, it senses me, and it unlocks that mag lock for egress. And then we also have to have an auxiliary push button, and the door has to unlock upon power failure and upon fire alarm activation if the building has a fire alarm system. With the door hardware release, that's the one I've been using as an example, it's the one on the right, it's the same type of lock. It's usually a mag lock, but instead of being released by a sensor, the lock is released, like I said, by a switch in the hardware that's mounted on the door. So same lock, different release methods. So with this application, the model codes don't require the auxiliary push button or the fire alarm release. That's news to some people, but the lock has to release for egress upon power failure. So the codes, I always like to say the codes are a minimum. You can use the auxiliary push button. You can use the fire alarm release. It might be required by the local jurisdiction, but it is not required by the model codes. So here we have two that look pretty similar. They are delayed egress on the left and controlled egress on the right. And they look similar, but the function is different and they're addressed in different code sections. So with delayed egress locks, they unlock the door for egress after a 15-second delay, or 30 seconds can be approved by the authority having jurisdiction. So these locks we're usually seeing now in mercantile occupancies like the secondary exits serving a retail space. The doors have to unlock immediately for egress if there's a fire alarm activation or if there's power failure. And then on the right, we have controlled egress locks, which are only permitted in healthcare facilities. I'm seeing people trying to use them in lots of other locations, but no, they are specifically permitted in healthcare facilities in the units where patients require containment for their safety or security. So common applications for those are memory care, maternity, pediatrics, and sometimes we see them in emergency departments. Also behavioral health, although there are some other things that can be done in behavioral health. So these doors they're different from delayed egress, which are going to let you out after 15 seconds. The one on the right, the controlled egress, those doors are going to remain locked until evacuation is needed. And the model codes have a long list of how that has to happen, what has to release those doors for egress. And then here we have two semi-related sections. So the stairwell reentry section addresses the need for building occupants to be able to leave the stairwell and re-enter the building if the stair becomes compromised during a fire. On the right, we have a brand new section, which I will be covering in a future session. And that is when you have an elevator lobby where the path of egress doesn't go directly to a stairwell. It goes through the tenant space usually. I mean, in this application, it would go through the tenant space and to a remote stairwell that's not right next to the elevator lobby. So this is a brand new section in the 2024 IBC. So make sure you tune in for a future session, and I'll talk about those and what the requirements are. There's been a section on that in NFPA 101 for a long time, but not in the I codes. So that's something new to know about. Finally, as we talk about special locking arrangements, I should say, there will be a new section in the 2027 I codes that covers interlocks, or in the code, they're called control vestibules. So this is an application that we commonly see in clean rooms and high security areas, was not covered by the code before. So there were inconsistencies between jurisdictions and from one AHJ to the next. So the way this works is when one door is opened, the other door cannot be opened until the first door comes to a close. So I will have a future session on this one. And all of these special locking arrangements that I mentioned do require the UL 294 or 1034 listings according to the 2024 codes, except that the I codes don't require the listings for stairway doors in the I code section that covers stairwell reentry. So NFPA 101 does require the listings for stairway doors with electrified locks. Now that's a whole nother topic. We'll talk about that on another day. So back to our list of special locking arrangements. Gone through all these different types of access control doors. We kind of classify them all together. If it's electrified hardware, it's access control. But the most common type of access control door, the most frequently used electrified hardware, is where we have access control and free egress. So there's been a code change that I'm going to talk about. But remember, in each section of the IBC commentary where it talks about UL 294 and UL 1034, it references those access control doors or our normal locking arrangements, and it says that the listing requirements don't apply to those. So what type of system is this? This is the one that you see all the time. This is where you have, you don't have hardware that is going to affect egress like a delayed egress system would or a controlled egress system would. So these are doors where there's usually a reader on the outside to release the hardware for ingress or access, but egress is not affected by the electronics of the system. So the doors meet the same requirement as doors with mechanical locking hardware, like as shown here on the slide. They unlatch with one releasing motion without a key, tool, special knowledge, or effort, with no tight grasping, pinching, or twisting of the wrist. And then the releasing hardware has to be mounted between 34 and 48 inches above the floor. There are some exceptions to that. So the problem with this type of system, code-related problem, for me, it was no problem because it's right there. The hardware complies with all of the same requirements that mechanical hardware has to comply with, but there was no specific code section to point to. As soon as it had a wire on it, everyone started looking in the special locking arrangements sections to see, okay, which section is going to apply. And there wasn't one. So someone would try to find one or apply delayed egress or apply controlled egress, or it just got really messy. So to give a little bit of background, in the 2021 edition of the I codes, a section was added that addressed monitored or recorded egress. So that would apply to doors with exit alarms, with a reader on the egress side to shunt the alarm, or doors where the reader on the egress side was used for time and attendance, but was not affecting the egress at all. So this section was added, and you can see the section here. And it says, these doors can either comply with one of the special locking arrangements sections, which are those numbers that you see there, or they have to be readily openable from the egress side without the use of a key or special knowledge or effort. So hopefully that sounds familiar to some of you. If it sounds familiar, it's because this is the requirement for mechanical locking hardware. It has to be readily openable from the egress side. So in the 2024 edition, this section was modified to include doors with access control systems. So instead of just monitored or recorded egress, now we have a section to point to for doors with access control and free egress. So as long as these doors are readily openable from the egress side without the use of a key or special knowledge or effort, the special locking arrangements sections don't apply. And note that there's no reference in this section to the UL 294 or UL 1034 listings for these types of systems. So with that said, codes are a minimum. Might be a specification item. It could be something that's required locally, but that is what the model codes require. So before we get to the Q&A, I just want to leave you with a few resources. idighardware.com has a page on the topics menu. You can see the topics menu there at the bottom. The page is called Special Locking Arrangements, and that page has information about each of the special locking arrangements, and then also links to additional articles and videos. I also recently wrote an article about the listings for electrified hardware for my Decoded series, which is in Door Security and Safety magazine. So that might be a good reference, especially if you need to share this information with somebody. I'm going to post these resources and the recordings on the live page of idighardware.com. So you can get there just by going idighardware.com/live. And then finally, some of you may be familiar with the Allegion Code Reference Guide. I just updated it. So there's a new version at idighardware.com/guide. I'll put that on the live page as well. We do still have the hard copies available, but there's also a digital flip book, or you can download a PDF, and both of those digital versions have links to additional information. So you can scan the QR code, or it's a pretty easy link. You can follow the link, or in the right sidebar of iDig Hardware, I also put the image of the book, and you can just click on it and get to it that way. So that wraps up part one of this session, and now we'll move on to the Q&A with my special guests, Mark Kuhn and Matt Phillips. I don't know. Oh, hello. Didn't know if you guys could hear me, see me, or...
Hey, Lori.
Oh, phew, okay.
Scary for a minute.
It was a little bit scary. Thank you to our technical crew and the moderators who are helping us out today. So we are going to start the Q&A portion now. We did have some questions, like I said, that were submitted ahead of time when people registered, and the moderators are queuing up some other questions for the three of us. I will be compiling a transcript of all the Q&A. I think you need to mute. A transcript of the Q&A, so that if your question doesn't get answered today, we'll have that transcript available with the resources that we'll have after the recording is posted. So if you don't have your question answered today, don't feel bad. There are a lot of people on the call, and we did get a bunch ahead of time. So also, some of the questions were specific to a certain topic, and we're going to cover some of those topics in other of these future sessions if it's about electrified hardware. And then some of the questions were really specific to a certain location. And as I said, the best way to get an answer to those questions is to contact your local ACE, which is your Allegion code expert. And if you missed it, you can go to the orange ball in the right sidebar of iDig hardware, and that is going to give you the list of who your ACE is. So we will get to all the questions somehow, some way. There were a few that we actually contacted the person individually to try to answer the question. So hopefully everyone gets their questions answered at some point. So I think we have a little separate chat going on here with the questions. We're trying to stay organized. So the first question is for me. And the question that came in was, when evaluating existing sites for retrofitting access control, how do you determine the use group of the building or space? So this is a great question because it acknowledges the fact that the use group or occupancy classification is really important to consider when you're trying to apply the codes, because like I mentioned with controlled egress, it only applies to one particular use group, and people try to put it in other use groups or use it in other use groups. So or delayed egress locks, there are some use groups where those are not permitted. So it's not always easy to figure out what use group or occupancy classification a building is, especially if it's an existing building. If it's a new building, that information should be on the plans, or you can get it from the architect. For existing buildings, it's actually should be on the certificate of occupancy and on the building permit. If you want to go digging, at the local town clerk's office or city offices, you can find it that way. You can also get a sense just from being in the building and looking at the plans to see what is this building being used for and which code sections would apply to this. One tricky one that's come up a lot lately is where you have a small assembly occupancy. There's actually a section in the IBC that talks about small assembly occupancies. And that would be an example of that would be if you had like a big conference center or training room, or one of the examples that came across my desk a couple weeks ago was a big boardroom, and they were assembly occupancies. So because of that, other code requirements came in. Even though it was an office building, a business occupancy, it had this assembly occupancy within it. So then all of a sudden we needed panic hardware. We couldn't use delayed egress and things like that. So I can't give you like the easy answer, although in the code reference guide, there are pages from NFPA 101 that have the actual definitions of each of the occupancy classifications, which we do have permission from NFPA to include those. And then on the IBC page in the code reference guide, it has a list of the occupancy classifications as well. So that's all I can help with as far as making it easier, but it's a good thing to look for sure.
All right, looks like the second one, I'm going to take this one, Lori. It says, I'm often confused about UL 294 versus UL 1034. What's the main difference? And could a product ever need to meet both? So great question. So the way I would look at this, or the bottom line of this, 294 is evaluating the brains of the access control system. So the logic, the communication, the power. And 1034 is more like the brawn. It's looking at the physical locks, resistance to mechanical and burglary attempts. So they somewhat work together to create a holistic, secure opening when you tie them together. But while their primary focus does differ, because they deal with electrified hardware, they do have a lot of overlap in their common testing for the electrical safety and reliability. So UL 294 primarily is access control. It's going to cover the logic in the system. Like I said, the brains. It's looking at the controllers, readers, power supplies, egress devices, things that make decisions to ensure that they grant and deny access correctly. So 294 has some unique tests to it. There's also in the listings, there's going to be levels on those particular items. So they're going to have a line security test as one of the unique items. A level 1 would have no line security, so no encryption. Level 4 would be all the way up to 256-bit AES encryption. So that test is going to verify that supervision and communication lines are secure against hacking, can't be spoofed in credentials. There is an entire section on controlled and delayed egress in 294 that's unique to 294, and that's evaluating the life safety logic. So the 15, 30-second delay limits, verifying that power drops, or when power drops, that it allows free egress. There's a standby power test. So again, a level 1 in standby power would mean you have no standby power. Level 4 would have up to 4 hours of power outage where that would continue to work. And then it has an endurance cycle test. It's a little bit different from 1034. So level 1 in 294 is going to be 1,000 cycles. The highest level 4 is going to be 100,000 cycles. Now, when you get into 1034, you start looking at more physical and mechanical strength tests. So you're going to have static strength tests. It's going to simulate sort of if you're using a crowbar or a jack to open the door. That'll go all the way up to 1,500 pounds. There's a couple other levels below that. There's a dynamic strength test where they swing a 100-pound solid steel ram on a kind of a pendulum fixturing 5 times to simulate, like you're kicking in a door or trying to batter down a door. There's going to be a tool manipulation test. It's kind of a unique test. It gives an operator 5 minutes to try to use a assembly of tools to pick the locks or try to break in. And then the endurance tests are going to be 100,000, which is the highest level in 294. It's the lowest level in 1034, all the way up to 250,000 cycles for 1034. But it should be noted that both of these, there's a lot of overlap in the electronic tests. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but they both have an under voltage and over voltage test to see if, building power spikes or dips cause any issues with the products. They're both going to have electrical transient tests, like if you get a lightning strike, temperature tests, and endurance tests. So there's a lot of overlap, but the difference mainly being the 294 looks at the brains and 1034 looks at the brawn. So the second part of that question, is there a situation where you would need both? On an opening, absolutely. So you could have a complete door opening where the power supply and the access control, like the card reader, might have UL 294 because they're decision-making products. But the electric strike or the mag lock might have 1034, and that would make sense. There's also situations where you can have a single product that has both. So delayed egress mag lock would be a perfect example, because 1034 is going to validate that mag lock's mechanical strength is good, and 294 is going to verify the delayed egress mechanisms are working like they're supposed to. And then I would be remiss if I didn't mention where it's misapplied. So UL 294 does frequently get misapplied, and the best example I'm going to give, and this is near and dear to Lori and I both, is electric strikes. So a lot of times what will happen is an AHJ will want to see a 294 listing on an electric strike because it has a wire on it. Well, unless that electric strike has any kind of brains or decision making in it, if you accept 294 and not the 1034, 294 has less stringent endurance requirements and strength testing. So level 1 across the board on UL 294 basically means you don't have anything. So if you accept that, you would actually be accepting a lesser degree of safety and security than you would be if you had a properly listed UL 1034 strike, electric strike. So I hope that answers that question. That's a good one.
It helped me out.
Yeah. It's a tricky one. It's a tricky one.
I think the next one's for me. It says, can I lock a door electronically if it will unlock when there's a fire? Another great question that comes up every week in my world. I can't tell you the amount of meetings that I'm in, and I'm sure this applies to every specification consultant, that an owner, an architect wants to lock a door in a path of egress and says, oh, it's okay because it'll unlock upon fire alarm. And we have to say no. So the answer to that question is, in most cases, no, but it is a very common misconception. So for a door to lock and unlock upon fire alarm, there's really only 2 conditions. A third one, if we want to talk about the elevator lobby that Lori brought up in her talk previous. So the first that comes to mind is controlled egress, and basically that's what we're doing, is we're controlling the egress. We are keeping people from egressing through a door, and we're doing it electronically. So The thing to remember about controlled egress, it is very specific to what occupancies it's applied to. So even in the controlled egress section, it says what occupancies it's applied to, and it's an I occupancy, I2 occupancy, and it's related to healthcare units where patients are required to be contained for their own safety or security. So those are the reasons we're allowed to use controlled egress. The other place, I said there's two that I can think of. The other place where I can think of a door that unlocks upon fire alarm is stairwell reentry. And it's important to remember when we're talking about stairwell reentry, we're talking about, first of all, we're talking about the normally secured side of the door. So we're talking about coming from the stairwell and entering into the floor, not from the floor to the stairwell. If we're going from the floor to the stairwell, we're required to have free egress in that way. But if you want to lock a door on the stairwell side and keep people from getting onto the floor, we do that electronically. We tie that into the fire alarm or the fire command center, or it has to be fail safe. And it's also important to remember that that is a secondary exit path. You know, our first exit path is to go down the stairwell and get out of the building. But if we get in that stairwell and we find that that stairwell is compromised with fire or smoke or something, and we need another path out of the building, that's where this code comes in, and it unlocks the door and allows you to find another path out of the building, a secondary egress path out of the building. Like I said, those are the two until recently, 2024, we have the elevator lobby code to come into play. So if you are stuck in an elevator lobby, and previous to this, the elevator lobby wasn't even addressed in IBC. It was addressed in NFPA 101, like Lori said, but it wasn't addressed in IBC. So if we had an elevator lobby previous to IBC 2024, we had to treat it like any other room, and we had to let people out of it. So if you imagine you're on the 15th floor of an office building and it's 1 o'clock in the morning and a fire alarm goes off and the elevator gets recalled to the first floor and I'm stuck inside of an elevator lobby, I have to be able to get out of that lobby. So previous to 2024, it was delayed egress was our answer to that. You had to have a delayed egress path out of that elevator lobby. And we're going to get into that a lot more in the future. Lori's going to have future sessions on it, so I won't dive too deep into that. But that would be the third situation where I could see where you could unlock a door upon fire alarm. But other than that, most cases, no. You have to allow free egress at all times. Good question, though.
Okay, and I love these hearts and thumbs ups and stuff, so keep them coming. That means we're doing a great job. So the next question is for me, and it just came in. It says, every reference you mentioned for UL 294 and UL 1034 were all referenced out of IBC Chapter 10 and NFPA 101 Chapter 7. Is there any reference to UL 294 and or UL 1034 if the doors are not in a means of egress, example, connecting doors between a classroom? So I'm going to try and keep this short, but the key there is the fact that in NFPA 101, so both of those chapters, 10 and 7, are means of egress chapters, and the requirements apply to doors in a means of egress. So in 101, the language is a little bit different, and the requirements apply to doors that are required. So required egress doors. In the IBC, it's different. It says that the requirements apply to doors that are required for egress and also doors that are provided for egress purposes. So if you have the example they give in the commentary, I think is like a hotel ballroom. And if the ballroom has 4 doors, but only 2 are required for egress, but there are 4 and they all look alike, then all 4 of those doors have to be compliant. So that goes for everything. That goes for panic hardware, it goes for door size, all the things. So as far as UL 294 and 1034 references to doors not in a means of egress, no, there's nothing specific about that. But the important thing to start with is if you're looking at a door, you have to figure out, is this door not only required for egress, but is it provided for egress purposes? If it's not provided for egress purposes, then basically the code requirements don't apply. But be real careful, because when code officials come along, they might disagree with you as far as whether that door is required for egress purposes. So between classrooms, often that door is not provided for egress purposes. It might be provided for convenience. And so that's why a door between classrooms, you can often lock that in a way that you wouldn't be able to lock it if it was part of the means of egress. But be careful on larger size classrooms, because the occupant load could calculate out large enough, even like some kindergarten classrooms. When you calculate the occupant load, it might come out to 50 people or more, and then all of a sudden you need 2 exits. So the door between classrooms could become a required means of egress in that case. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay, I'm gonna take the next one. So we got, what's the best place to check if a product is listed to UL 294 or 1034? Where can I find the most up-to-date official information? Good question. So a lot of times spec sheets and catalogs maybe not the most up-to-date. So the best place to look for that is on online directories for the national recognized testing labs, or NERDLs, that evaluate the product. So that would be, in our industry, typically that's going to be UL or Intertech, and they both have their own systems for doing this. UL Product IQ is the one that UL uses, and Intertech has an ETL listing mark directory. One thing I want to touch on real quick is it's a common misconception that only UL can test to UL standards. That's not true. UL 294 and 1034, those are ANSI approved standards, so any OSHA recognized NRTL can certify to those. I'll have Lori get the links to both of the locations, but UL's Product IQ and Intertech's ETL directory differ just a little bit. Product IQ is their official online database. It's free. You can create a free account. They also have an abridged version that you can search without creating an account, but the free account does get you a lot more information. It gives you the ability to search by the manufacturer. You can look up model numbers. You can look it up by UL standards if you want. And just a quick kind of pro tip, if you do start using Product IQ, UL categorizes products in what they call categories, and they have what are called CCNs, or category control numbers, assigned to them. So you can actually go into the Product IQ and you can search by that CCN. So UL 294 products are covered under the ALVY CCN. So if you search by that, it'll pull up any UL 294 listed product from any company within the database. And then the UL 1034 products are under CVXY. Intertech's directory, their ETL listing directory, is very similar. It's free. It's a public online directory. The searching capabilities are very similar. They don't categorize by CCN, so that's something to keep in mind. Why are these important? Is the product is listing is it's suspended or modified or updated. These are generally done in real time, not always, but they're going to be a lot more up to date. Some of them you can pull down those online directories, and AHJs will accept just that online listing, and they should. That's how UL and Intertech both push that. So if the product isn't actively listed, I would just be cautious. UL just went through a large-scale data transfer, and if something's not quite right, make sure to contact the manufacturer, because it could very well be that it is right. It's just not in their newer system. So, yeah. So there you go.
I'm going to take the next one. It says, what function does a request to exit switch play in an opening with access control? Love this question, because again, it is really misunderstood in the industry. Actually, kind of misunderstood outside the industry. If you specify a request to exit switch, or we all refer to as an RX switch, and you're an access control provider, or you're a hardware specification writer, you kind of understand the part that it plays, but it seems people outside of that don't understand it. So I'll take a minute and explain. So basically, in most cases, the RX switch, or the request to exit switch, it's part of the opening. The only reason it's there is to be part of the door monitoring system. And it works to shunt the door position switch so that every time the door opens, the door position switch doesn't tell the access control that somebody has forced the door open. So a request to exit switch can take in many forms. It can be a motion detector at the door. just saying, hey, somebody's approached the door, they're leaving in the proper way. It could be a micro switch in a lever. It could be a micro switch in a panic bar. It could be a lot of different things, but again, its main function is to let the access control system know that someone has properly egressed. Again, an example would be by pushing on a panic bar. They have properly egressed so that the door position switch says, okay, someone left okay, and I don't need to send some sort of a forced entry alarm. A lot of people, and LOT, capital letters, think the RX switch is controlling egress. And like I said, in most cases, the RX switch is not controlling egress. I can think of 2 cases where the RX switch or an RX switch or request X switch does control egress, and Lori talked about them in her talk earlier, and that is in a sensor release situation. A sensor release situation, the sensor itself is a request exit switch. Approaching that door initiates the passive infrared detector and allows me to exit. So the RX switch is allowing me to exit. There are secondary requirements in that. Again, Lori will talk about those in future. I like how I'm not stealing your thunder, Lori. And the second one I think of, she talked about also, is door hardware release. So in a door hardware release, again, I think of a panic bar. The panic bar has a request exit switch or an RX switch built into the bar. You push on the panic bar, that switch cuts power to the mag lock and allows you to egress. So that is another thing where a request to exit switch is the piece of hardware that is permitting you to egress the door. All other situations outside of those 2, sensor release and door hardware release, all other situations, the request to exit switch is just part of the monitoring system and has nothing to do with allowing you to egress the open.
Okay, great job not stealing my thunder. Like I said, we will talk a lot about these specific systems in future sessions. And Matt, when you give me those links, I will include them to the UL directory and the other one, the Interdec directory, in the resources for this session. So everyone will have access to that. So I'm going to take the last quick question, and then I just have a few things to say to wrap up. So the question is, in the industry, we have been using the term access control system to describe various types of doors with electrified hardware. Is this term defined in the IBC? And that is a fantastic point, because we use access control, I think, as like a generic term. We could have a door with delayed egress that has an access control reader, and all of a sudden it's part of the access control plans, right? So we have to start thinking about things a little differently, maybe, at least when we're talking about the codes. So I do think that, so if you were listening when I talked about the new section that addresses access control systems, those access control systems are, in my mind, the normal locking arrangements where the doors allow free egress via the mechanical hardware. So I think it would be really beneficial to have a definition for that term in the code so that we know how the code is calling it, like how the code is using that term access control system. So it's on my wish list, and we're just getting started with the code change proposals for the 2030 edition of the IBC. Time flies. And also there's a lot of good information in the commentary, the IBC commentary. And I and others have the opportunity to help edit that. So we've clarified a lot of things over the last, few editions of the codes. So if you don't have the IBC commentary, grab a copy and check it out. It's got a lot of good information that's really helpful when you're trying to understand the requirements related to doors, especially. So we are almost out of time, which is crazy. Time really does fly. So I just want to wrap it up with a few things. So the next live session is scheduled for September 15th. So mark your calendars, same time. And the topic is going to be a more in-depth look at the codes for sensor release locks and door hardware release locks. And that's a tongue twister. So like I said today, those are usually applied to mag locks. Although just this morning, someone contacted me and said, could I apply this to a power bolt? So the answer is yes, but power bolts are not my favorite. So I'll talk about that in that session. Mark is going to be here with me again. And also, I'm so excited that I'm excited about you too, Mark, but we have Don Cherry, who so many people know and love. Don and I have worked together for the last, 25 years or more. So I'm excited to have him on the next session. And he just brings so much experience and wisdom about anything with wires. So excited for that. So next week, you will receive an email with a registration link for the next session. Also a link to the page. I've been building out the page for where I'm going to keep the recording. There will be a recording of the first part. If you want to just like, what'd she say again? You can listen to that, or you can listen to the whole recording with the Q&A. I know some people couldn't make it today, but we're excited to hear the recording afterwards. So that will be there, along with links to the resources like the article about listings and the code reference guide and all the things that I mentioned will be there. I think I even put a PDF of the slides there. So all that stuff will be there, and you will receive that next week. And the other thing that a lot of people have been asking about, this might have been the most frequently asked question, was continuing education credit. So continuing education credit for DHI is available for today's live session. So I have created a little certificate, and when you get the email with the links to everything and the links to the recordings and all that, for all the people who attended today, they will receive the certificate. If they didn't attend today, they won't receive the certificate. I don't know how DHI will want to handle that, but so everyone who is here today will get a certificate, and you can use it for continuing education through DHI. AIA is a little bit more complicated because AIA only gives credit for the presentation part where I was speaking at the beginning, and it would be only worth about a quarter of a point, I think, because the rest of this Q&A doesn't count. So my plan with this is the first 3 sessions will be before the end of this year. I haven't decided on the third topic yet, but that will be like probably the beginning of November before we get into holiday time. So at the end of those 3 sessions, my plan is to combine the 3 presentation portions into a 1-hour-ish session that will qualify for AIA continuing education credit. So that is the plan for that. And then I think I said we were going to have 4 sessions. I think we're going to have 6. And so the beginning of next year, we will have the additional 3. Again, at the end of that, combine the 3 into 1, the 3 little presentation parts into 1, and offer continuing education credit through AIA for that. And it would be, I think, 1 HSW point. So if you're looking for AIA credit, I'm trying to take care of you. So with that, I will say thank you for attending. We hope to see you for the next session on September 15th. And thank you to my special guests and the moderators behind the scene who did a fantastic job. And thank you all for attending. Take care.